Christopher.
Sir, ladies, gentlemen, comrades, brothers and sisters, CSPAN viewers. Wish I'd brought my own book to wave. I didn't think of it, nor did John, rather sadly. Strangely neglected book on the special relationship called Blood, Class and Empire, now available in paperback and at fine bookstores everywhere, which argues against the view much more recently and with much more publicity and panache taken by Andrew Roberts, who has a rather proprietorial attitude towards Anglo-American relations and thinks that they belong in some mystical way to the Anglo-Saxon right wing, that in some deeply layered manner it's a common, almost ethnic and literary inheritance of a conservative kind. My book argues, that actually there are two great paradoxes about the special relationship. One is that it's historically been something that's flourished mainly on the left of center. I could take a long time justifying this, but I'll condense as much as I can, but it'll, I think, throw some of Geoffrey's remarks into some relief. One of the oldest traditions of the English radical left is an affection for the United States, for the American Revolution, for America as the land of equality, not just of opportunity, but of the franchise, of the opening of land to the landless, the refugee of the persecuted, and the immigrants, the reactionaries of the 19th century spent an enormous time. Charles Dickens's American Notes would be the salient case here, trying to discredit the American Revolution and its British sympathizers. The locus classicus of my case would be something they don't teach you in school, I suppose, the great campaign by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to defend the American Union against secession and slavery in the 1860s, at a time when everyone from the liberal hypocrite William Gladstone to the London Times, to the government of the day, to the cotton and other interests, favored the Confederacy and hoped to build it a navy in the city of Liverpool. If you read The Education of Henry Adams, I think you'll have to agree, still the classic American memoir and autobiography, you will find that when he was attached to his father's unhappy ministry in London at that period, he found that his only friends were the friends of Karl Marx, and the only friends of the American Union were the English working men's associations. This is a tradition that hasn't been completely buried yet, and I think stands in need of some resuscitation. So I'd stipulate that to begin with, but there's another paradox that you might say goes the other way. The reason why you need a special relationship to start off with is the need of the British Empire to disburden itself of colonies that it could no longer afford to pay for or govern or defend. The entire rise to power as an empire of the United States, not the entire, because that would mean exempting the war against the Spanish Empire, but the greater part of the American rise to an unchallenged world dominance is the direct succession that is involved between British governments confessedly saying to Washington that they can no longer stand the strain, and that because of other engagements in Europe, usually with Germany, they require American help, and the price for this will be the transfer of some colonies, perhaps a gold standard or two here and there, and some other responsibilities. If you look at where American troops are currently deployed in the world, and where they've been deployed for a great deal of time, or where they're engaged in the difficulties, that some of which Geoffrey mentions, you will find, whether it's Palestine, Israel, whether it's the Durand line in Afghanistan, Pakistan, whether it's the borders of Iraq, or in innumerable other places I could cite and you could add, these are lines drawn by retreating, ebbing, the long withdrawing roar, if you like, of British colonialism. For the Americans to have picked up this responsibility, so what shall we say, perhaps incautiously, in some respects uncomplainingly, is to give you an idea of how the inequality sometimes goes, if you like, the other way. Churchill and Roosevelt, as you will know, though they're often thought of as the heavenly twins of the special relationship, nobody who's read William Roger Lewis's edition of their complete correspondence can fail to notice Mr. Churchill hated Mr. Roosevelt, and Mr. Roosevelt despised and had nothing but contempt for Mr. Churchill. And it was a race, really, to see which of these two emotions would get the upper hand. Mr. Churchill did not like the price that was exacted from him for Lend-Lease, did not like being told that the congressional isolationists had to be appeased and the British colonies had to be given up for every tranche of aid in the miserly way that it was handed out at the time, as Geoffrey said, when London itself was being bombed and when the American ambassador, Mr. Joseph Kennedy, of ill repute and ill fame and unmourned memory, was an open sympathizer of the Third Reich. Very hard to picture a less happy moment than that. The relationship between President Truman and Prime Minister Attlee at the dawn of the Cold War, a great deal warmer and more natural between Democrats and Labour. Ernest Bevin, in fact, signed the NATO treaty with a signet ring that had been given to him. This was Mr. Attlee's foreign secretary. A signet ring given to him as a young man by Samuel Gompers, founder of the American Federation of Labour. That's the British stamp still on the NATO treaty. The post-Labour relationship between Sir Anthony Eden and the United States is probably well known and well remembered as the lowest moment there ever was. The eviction of Britain, France and Israel from Suez by President Eisenhower, his willingness not just to tell the Israelis they couldn't sell Israeli bonds in New York anymore if they weren't out of Gaza by the end of the week, but his openly saying to a British Prime Minister that he would withdraw dollar support for the sterling pound, and willingness to actually do so, is the origin of something that is very little understood on this side of the Atlantic, the extreme hatred of the United States felt by large sections of the British Conservative Party from then on. Muted for reasons of tact and reasons of diplomacy, but very strong and palpable. Mr. Macmillan, the successor of that affair, practically installed in Downing Street by Eisenhower's pressure, had actually a relationship of family with President Kennedy, as well as a sort of avuncular relationship that went beyond that. But it was a fairly tepid business and fairly short-lived, and it founded on the refusal of the United States to take seriously Britain's claim to be an independent rather than a subordinate to American nuclear power. Cantering, I'll keep this canter as short as I can, but I think it's necessary to set the scene. The Wilson-Callaghan Labour governments of the 70s and 60s were immolated, in effect, I would say, immolated morally and politically by their decision that at all costs they had to support the American position in Indochina in return for American support for the sterling area and the price of a highly overvalued pound. When the pound collapsed and when the Vietnam enterprise collapsed also, I think a generation of latent or blatant anti-Americans had been created all across the British media, all across the British academe, all across actually the generation born as I was in the early years of the baby boom. A catastrophe from which neither country has yet recovered. Prime Minister Heath didn't like the Americans, particularly didn't like Secretary of State Kissinger or President Nixon, believed Britain's destiny lay entirely with Europe. Mrs. Thatcher was exactly the other way around, as you know, used the United States to enhance British prestige internationally and as leverage against Europe. Thus, skipping only the contemptible figure of John Major, who managed to be despised all across the United States and all across Europe, in part because he helped to fail Europe's first post-1989 test, the first serious test Europe had to undergo after its reunification after the end of the Cold War. In other words, its utter failure to prevent the recrudescence of ethnic fascism in former Yugoslavia. In Major's case, not even not to prevent it, but to be seconding it, supporting it, endorsing it, helping it. Stepping over that appalling episode, when we come to Tony Blair, we have to acknowledge, whatever else we may have to say, something very important and unique and unprecedented. There had not before been a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who was neither pro-European nor, in the contra sense, pro-American. Didn't feel he had to choose between the two. Felt at home with both relationships. Was as easy, if you like, taking a holiday in Tuscany as he would have been playing American songs in that rock band of his, or with American culture in general, and of the right generation to be doing all these things. No more playing off Washington against Brussels, Washington against Paris, Washington against Berlin, none of that. But able to know a crisis when he saw one. And also, another achievement, to have been a good personal friend in time of trouble of two very radically different presidents, Mr. Clinton and later Mr. Bush. And when I say standing by them in time of trouble, I make no particular point about whether Prime Minister Blair should have been so fawning on President Clinton when he was caught lying and perjuring and fornicating in the Oval Office and the Lincoln bedroom. I'd rather move directly to September the 11th and the serial consequences of it and say what I mean by in time of trouble, and quote John Howard, the Prime Minister of Australia, who, when accused of being too uncritically or enthusiastically pro-American in the same epoch, and being apparently willing to go wherever America might lead, said in his unmistakable tones, well, there's not much point in being 60% of a friend at a time like this. I thought a very good and useful remark, simple but not completely uncomplicated. Because 60% friendship is not what anybody needs in a time when civil society has been attacked by the most violent and promiscuous form of barbarism to have emerged in this generation's lifetime. So I'm not a bit surprised, doesn't surprise or shock me, I'm sorry to say, Geoffrey, in the least, that Mr. Blair can be overheard speaking soothingly to Mr. Bush in St. Petersburg. That's sort of part of the prime ministerial job, and it's well known that Mr. Bush is a slightly prickly and impatient person. It's much more interesting what Mr. Blair said in public, and he's been criticized much more for what he said deliberately on the podium of his party conference, which were the following words. Shortly after September 11th, he said, addressing our American friends, cousins, comrades, he said, "We were with you with the first, and we will be with you till the last." That surely is what friendship and solidarity actually mean. Sir Christopher Mayer, Geoffrey uses the euphemism gossipy for the tawdry little book that our former envoy here produced on this subject, said that when he heard the words, he began to feel uneasy because he said, words like that have consequences. You might be taken up on them. Well, I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what is the point of making a declaration of unconditional brotherhood and solidarity if you're not prepared to be taken up on it? What's the value of your word? What, in fact, are your values, if such is not the case? The main sobriquet or epithet that Mr. Blair has reaped for this unequivocal position of friendship is the word poodle. There isn't a child in England who doesn't know how to repeat this childish accusation. Mr. Blair is Mr. Bush's poodle. They hear it from childish adults, they pick it up, and they giggle over it themselves. Well, let me just remind you of something. It was not Mr. Clinton or Secretary of State Albright who wanted to finish the job with Slobodan Milosevic and his mad dream of a greater Serbia and an ethnically cleansed and pulverized Balkans, a wave of fascism that would have spread into Hungary and Romania and Transylvania and beyond if it hadn't been, and perhaps into Greece and Turkish relations if it hadn't been contained. It was Prime Minister Blair who urged them to do it and said that British troops would be willing to do it even if American troops were not. This is not poodledom. This is not, I'll underline it, this is not poodledom. Mr. Blair demonstrated the same fortitude in the case of Sierra Leone when over the objections of almost everybody who thought, well, why not just leave a treaty torn up with an African country, former dependency of ours, founded to protect runaway and freed slaves? Why not let them be overrun by a Liberian invasion run by a group of hand-lopping thugs and irredentists with very strong ties through the diamond and blood diamond racket to Al-Qaeda? Who cares if we don't stand by the treaty? Anyway, it's not worth the life of a British grenadier. Mr. Blair took the view that was not the case, and at the cost of no casualties at all turned the invasion back, greatly, I think, to his credit. In the case of Afghanistan, as we know, he also said to President Bush that British troops were ready to intervene directly, not just by proxy through the Northern Alliance, whether American forces were available or not. But more important still, I think, in showing the puerility of this poodle charge, is the speech he gave in 1999 in Chicago. Actually, it was part of a series of speeches after the removal of Slobodan Milosevic from power. Mr. Blair repeatedly said, at a time when George Bush was the governor of Texas, preparing to run as an isolationist against the interventionism of Albert Gore and Bill Clinton, against the interventionism that Bush denounced and Cheney denounced in the debate, said, you're using American troops for nation building, you can't do that. You're using them for humanitarian purposes around the world. That's not what our 82nd Airborne is for. You're quite wrong. President Clinton and Vice President Gore had repeatedly sworn that there would be another appointment with Saddam Hussein that would have to be kept one time or another. But before that, Mr. Blair had said, we have one dictator down, we have another to go. There's an unpostponable confrontation with Saddam Hussein, and the only question is going to be, does he pick the timing of it, or do we? And just for once, we pick the timing. Up until then, Saddam chose. I know when I'll invade Iran. I know when I'll invade Kuwait. I know when I'll send death squads to hijack tourist boats in the Mediterranean. I know when I'll give sanctuary to the man who blew up the World Trade Center in 1993. I have the initiative here. I can switch allegiance from the PLO to Islamic Jihad and Hamas and pay for the suicide bombings in Palestine to keep the West off balance. I call the shots here. He decided when there'd be a crisis. Now, for deciding that for once we would pick the moment, we have never heard the end, and we never will hear the end from our favorite journalists and clever clogs types. Never hear the end of a campaign of slander and cynicism and defamation, because we produced the necessary evidence, because we said this man is a permanent menace with his genocidal politics, his weapons of mass destruction, his unending support for nihilism and terrorism. It's not just we've waited, we're doing this too quickly, it's that we've waited far too long. And for this, as I say, the campaign of hateful misrepresentation has never, and I think never will, stop. Proof positive, by the way, that history is not always written by the winners. The losers have written this, and I expect they will carry the day in the history books. Thus, I'll end with two ironies. Actually, Mr. Blair probably spoiled everything for the relationship and for himself by being untrue to the principles I've just described. He asked for, after the United Nations Security Council had voted unanimously, including the vote of Syria, to require, on pain of serious consequences, that Iraq, after decades of defiance, come into compliance with the relevant resolutions, not just on weaponry, but on many other things too. A resolution that good legal minds have said, and any moral sense would tell you, was self-enforcing and long overdue, and representing finally the unanimity that any organization of international stature with any vertebrae should have had to feel it had to pass. Syria, not exempted. Mr. Blair said, let's just try this again. Let's have another resolution because I need it for my parliamentary Labour Party. A rather parochial demand, amounting, if you like, to something of a quid pro quo, a political favour of a paltry kind. And because he's not a poodle and isn't regarded as such by the administration, that's another misrepresentation and libel, because they take him so seriously, because British advice is heeded, because British prestige does amount to something, because the Prime Minister is understood as a serious person, he was given what he asked. And therefore the whole noble enterprise of the removal of Saddam Hussein became a matter of nuts and bolts and details and matters of timing, exact locations of sources and methods of terror and WMD, trivializing the whole matter into one of inspections and reducing it to the very banal state in which the argument has declined today. Thus, Mr. Blair undid his cause and himself and his place in history, I think, not by being too much in line with the policy of the United States, correct as it was, but by being not so much so, insufficiently so. Closing irony. Remember what I said about the way the Tories have always hated and resented the loss of their empire and the assumption of those responsibilities that they couldn't discharge any longer, and overlook the empty letters sent by the Arabist dinosaurs of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office who have never got anything right and never will. And note that Jeffrey said that it was last autumn that the little charmer and imposter and publicity specialist David Cameron made a measured statement, taking his distance from the United States. It wasn't last autumn, ladies and gentlemen. It was on the morning of September the 11th that he called his press conference and told the American embassy that he would not be available for any other events. He was going to make his own little declaration of independence as a conservative and to say that from now on this day of all days, the United States could not count on any further British friendship or could not count on it as an axiom, or could not count on it as a principle. It would from now on have to be bargained for. It would have to be traded. It would have to be quid pro quo. Well, that works for me, and it works for my thesis. It works for my book, because it replaces the virus of anti-Americanism where it always was, where it ought to be, and where it belongs, on the forces of reaction, and with the rump of the British Tory party, whose strange death, as adumbrated by Geoffrey, cannot come quick enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.